Hello, everyone. My name is Camilla Connor, and I'm here as a research assistant with the Dana Foundation Career Network and Neuroscience Society. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Natalie Phillips, who serves as an associate professor of English and affiliated faculty with the Cognitive Science Department at Michigan State University, a co-director of the Digital Humanities and Literary Cognition Lab at Michigan State University, and a pioneer in literary humanities. Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. To start, could you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your career pathway? What is your background and where are you now?
As you mentioned, I'm Professor Natalie Phillips, and I came in to Michigan State from Stanford, where I did my PhD, and I was cheerfully going along, believing I was going to just be doing a PhD in English, and got really interested in the history of science and the history of cognitive science. And that led me through a whole series of spirals and all sorts of dorkdom into really loving and learning about as many cognitive and neuroscientific studies, in particular of attention, as I could. And in the end, I actually ended up running an MRI study of attention and literature, particularly attention in Jane Austen. And it was a really unusual turning point in my career. Everyone in my professional world sort of, I think, looked at me as though I'd gone a little mad, especially coming in from the humanities side. Like, what are you doing running neuroscience experiments? But it really shaped and changed my trajectory. I now not only get to teach literature classes, wonderful classes in novels and poetry and teach, all these things where it's just like traditional English classes. But I'm also teaching a class right now that's an introduction to cognitive science and literary history of mind, where students get to design their own interdisciplinary experiments at the end of it. And I run an interdisciplinary lab where we have students from English, neuroscience, engineering, data, data science, all the things, education, everything, working together to design new projects.
That's amazing and very inspirational. Was there a specific moment throughout your career trajectory that led you to combine neuroscience and the humanities?
Um, I would say it really was the dorkery and serendipity. But I was living with three international roommates, two Italian economists, and one young woman from New Zealand, Sam Holdsworth, who was working as an MR researcher. So researching new techniques for developing MRI techniques to better advance our knowledge of brain imaging, but also full body imaging. And I would go in and be a volunteer subject. And after a while, I think one day she asked me, she said, she knew I was getting more and more interested in the history of attention and distraction. And she said, would you ever want to design an experiment? And I said, absolutely not. Like, this was absolutely impossible. And then, of course, in the moment after that, we both looked at each other and we started to say, but what if we tried? And that was sort of the path that really started to change everything. I think the second moment was when I still kept thinking, I didn't believe I could do it. And I tried to meet with Rebecca Sachs, who's a fabulous neuroscientist at MIT, and pulled her aside, told her all about the experiment design, tried to make sure everything was, down to the wire, like how are we waiting the appropriate number of seconds to clear the blood data, and I've got it like down to the experiment now. And I remember she looked at me and I said, so, you know, do you think someone would want to do this? And she said, you're clearly going to be the one to do this, and you're going to want to analyze the data. And I remember I turned to her and I said, but if you had a great idea for a novel, wouldn't you give it to your novelist friend? And I remember she looked back at me and she goes, you're going to want to analyze the data. And she just sent me home. And that was when I realized, I was like, nope, I'm just going to keep learning this, and kind of kept going from there.
It sounds like such an interdisciplinary group of people that led you to that. So,
Yeah.
in your opinion, how do the integrations of the humanities and neuroscience complement each other, and why do you think this is important?
I think about this a lot. I think so from the humanities side, I think that having a neuroscientific and cognitive understanding of all of the complex ways we engage with art, with music, with literature, all of this, I think it only expands our knowledge of the amazing complexity of what's going on in the brain, not just generally, but also individually, right? And across different neurotypes and things like this. I think that that's just intrinsically exciting for those in the humanities. I think there's a risk at times of people thinking we want to like boil it down to some scientific truth. And it's like, no, it doesn't need to be this way. It can be about actually increasing our the complexity of our understanding. But from the scientific side and the neuroscientific side, I think what's really exciting is that very complexity of trying to handle things like art and literature and music. And I'll say particularly literature because it's being read at its own speed. And so not everything's being presented at the same time point. It really pushes against some of our traditional experiment design models in neuroscience and in cognitive science. And what I think that does is it pushes us to advance and take new steps. So in our case, we were one of the first at Stanford to integrate fMRI and fMRI compatible eye tracking. That was way back. People have done it since then. But I think that the act of trying to work with incredibly complex materials and not just refine it down to that one single variable, that you can isolate, and moving towards more naturalistic, more humanistic sort of designs, that are truly complex and getting towards what we are trying to get towards analyzing in the real world really does push neuroscience to develop new methods.
Amazing. So, can you share a current project, research study, or initiative you're currently working on that focuses on, sorry, let me re-ask that question.
You're fine.
Can you share a current project, research study, or initiative that you're working on that focuses on the intersection of neuroscience and the humanities?
Oh goodness, we have a lot, um, but a lot of them aren't pure neuroscience. A lot of them are cognitive science, angled with neuroscience components or future neuroscience angles. Um, since working on my initial study of attention in Jane Austen, um, I was invited by Gabby Starr, along with Anjan Chatterjee and Ed Vessel and Amy Belfi, who I think you've been able to talk with, um, to design a poetry study, thinking about peak beauty moments in moments that we find the most powerful, pleasurable, or moving in poems or not as we read. And so we really work to develop techniques for capturing that ebb and flow of pleasure. So we have a poetry study, we have a study that's cognitive on the stories that we actually hear when listening to music without any words. So it's actually a cross-cultural study that's in collaboration with Lisa Margulis at Princeton and Devin McCauley here at MSU, and involves comparisons with US listeners and as well as Chinese listeners from Demen. Um, and we're involved in that in terms of looking at the really complex ways these narratives intersect and are enculturated cognitively. Um, but the final project that has been the most recent, and I think it's going more towards the neuroscientific again, but from a new angle, is that during COVID, a lot of this was not able to be brought to scan technologies for a long while. We happened to receive an amazing grant from the Mellon Foundation to explore the ways that people were turning to everyday creativity during the pandemic. And so we collected a whole set of materials of, photos, all of this. You don't get brain imaging of that. But we have an amazing global collection of the ways that people turned to creativity during COVID, how they described it helping them, their pandemic experience. And where we're going with that is we're really thinking about ways that this can be used for healthcare workers, and researching the everyday creative outlets that people find to lower stress, lower cortisol levels, and working to talk with a group in nursing and engineering, talking about wearables in particular for measuring all sorts of different heart rate variability, cortisol, all sorts of things. But again, moving into more naturalistic environments, but thinking about really micro moments of creativity, not like painting artworks by Picasso, but like really truly everyday moments that would really just reduce stress for healthcare workers and then later patients. So that's one I'm really excited to be starting on.
Yeah, that's super exciting and very important work. So my last question is for someone who might be interested in this career path, what advice would you give to them?
Ooh, try not to be so afraid. Um, yeah, I think that's I feel like there's so much I feel like there's so much energy around the separation of these spheres, around the humanities and sciences. And I feel like it's that the upcoming generation and our generation have been working really hard to break those down. And I think when I began this, I never gave myself I mean, what Rebecca Sachs said, which is like, no, you'll be able to do this. You'll analyze your own data. And I thought to myself, impossible, you know. And indeed, no, not impossible. And it's not because I then do it all by myself, right? But with a team of collaborators that can rigorously engage with this data. And sometimes that means coming from a rigorous group of undergraduates or graduate students or a widespread global collaboration, starting at NYU. It doesn't matter, but the point is that um, that some of the most exciting ideas can in fact go somewhere and not to underestimate yourself.
That's great advice. Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences. Your work really shows how neuroscience can influence and be influenced by the humanities and literature. For those watching, we hope this conversation inspires you to think about the interdisciplinary nature of neuroscience in your own work. As always, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more interviews like this.